Adrenal insufficiency creates a fundamental mismatch between the body's internal clock and the external world, often leaving people in a state that feels both physically depleted and mentally overstimulated at the same time. This paradox of being tired but wired isn't just a side effect of chronic illness, it's a direct consequence of how our physiology handles hormone replacement.
It really comes down to the loss of that elegant, self-regulating feedback loop we call the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or HPA axis. In a healthy system, the brain and the adrenal glands are in constant conversation. They're fine-tuning cortisol levels every minute of the day based on light, stress, and even food. When those glands can't produce cortisol, we have to step in with oral medications like hydrocortisone or prednisone. But as helpful as they are, these pills are blunt instruments compared to the body's natural precision. They create peaks and valleys of hormone levels that don't always align with what the rest of our cells expect.
That misalignment seems most obvious during the early morning hours. We're taught that cortisol is the stress hormone, but researchers often describe it more as our natural wake-up signal. There's this phenomenon called the cortisol awakening response, where levels should naturally surge just before we open our eyes. For someone with adrenal insufficiency, that surge simply doesn't happen unless they've already timed a dose to kick in, right?
Exactly. That morning surge is what primes the pump. It raises your blood pressure slightly, mobilizes glucose so your brain has fuel before breakfast, and signals the brain to move from sleep to alertness. When you rely on a tablet, there's a significant lag. You wake up with near zero cortisol, feeling what many describe as a heavy, leaden exhaustion or intense brain fog. Then you take your medication, and it takes 30 to 60 minutes to hit the bloodstream. You're effectively starting your day in a deficit, and that sets a physiological tone for the next 16 hours.
If the morning is about a missing surge, then the night seems to be about a missing decline. In a typical rhythm, cortisol should be at its lowest point around midnight to allow melatonin to rise and body temperature to drop. But if a patient takes a replacement dose too late in the afternoon or evening, are they essentially tricking their brain into thinking it's still high noon?
That's a major factor in the wired but exhausted feeling. If the evening dose is too high or timed poorly, the brain stays in a state of hyperarousal. It's important to remember that glucocorticoid receptors are everywhere, including the parts of the brain that regulate sleep architecture. High levels of circulating steroids in the evening can suppress REM sleep and increase sleep fragmentation. You might be in bed for 8 hours, but your brain is essentially being told to stay on guard. It prevents the transition into those deep restorative stages where tissue repair and immune regulation actually happen.
It's interesting you mention sleep architecture because so many people in the community report these incredibly vivid, almost exhausting dreams. Is there a physiological link between low or fluctuating cortisol and the intensity of what we experience during REM sleep?
There absolutely is. There's a fascinating bidirectional relationship here. While high cortisol can suppress REM, low overnight cortisol can lead to frequent awakenings and what researchers call REM rebound or increased dream recall. Some studies, like those published in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism, suggest that when cortisol levels are subphysiological during the night, it can actually trigger the body's backup stress systems. If your blood sugar dips because you don't have enough cortisol to maintain it, your body might release adrenaline to compensate. That adrenaline spike is what often jerks people awake at 3 a.m. with a racing heart and a mind that won't shut off. It's a survival mechanism that's misfiring because the primary regulator, cortisol, isn't there to keep things steady.
So the 3 a.m. wake up isn't just insomnia in the traditional sense. It's potentially a metabolic emergency where the body is panicking because its fuel levels are dropping. That would explain why some people find that a small, complex carb snack before bed helps, even though it feels counterintuitive to eat right before sleeping.
It highlights the difference between being sleepy and being fatigued. Sleepiness is that heavy-lidded feeling you get when you've been awake too long. It's driven by adenosine buildup in the brain and is usually cured by a good nap. Fatigue, especially in adrenal insufficiency, is a systemic energy crisis. You can be profoundly fatigued, your muscles are weak, your brain is slow, but because your stress hormones are fluctuating or your blood sugar is unstable, you aren't actually sleepy. You're stuck in a physiological limbo where you're too exhausted to function but too chemically alert to rest.
That distinction is so important because it validates why standard sleep advice, like just going to bed earlier, often fails this population. If the underlying issue is a hormonal mismatch, more hours in bed won't fix the quality of that sleep. And then we have the afternoon crash. Most people get a little dip after lunch, but for those with AI, it can feel like a total system shutdown. Is that usually the morning dose wearing off?
Usually, yes. Hydrocortisone has a very short half-life, often only about 90 minutes to 2 hours in the blood. By the time you hit 2 or 3 p.m., that morning dose is long gone. If the second dose hasn't been timed correctly, you hit a cortisol gap. The body starts to struggle with blood pressure regulation and glucose metabolism again. This is why many endocrinologists recommend a 3-dose schedule, breakfast, lunch, and late afternoon, to try and smooth out those gaps. But every time you add a dose, you risk overlapping them and creating a peak that's too high, which then interferes with sleep later that night. It's a very narrow tightrope to walk.
It seems like a cycle that feeds on itself. Poor sleep makes you more sensitive to stress the next day, which might mean you need more medication, which then potentially disrupts your sleep again. How much do other factors like mineraloid balance play into this? We focus so much on cortisol, but many people with primary adrenal insufficiency are also managing aldosterone and salt wasting.
Aldosterone is the silent partner in sleep disruption. If your fludrocortisone dose isn't right, or if you're low on salt, your body struggles to hold on to fluid. This leads to orthostatic issues during the day, which is exhausting, but at night, it can cause frequent trips to the bathroom. Beyond the obvious disruption of waking up to pee, low salt levels can also trigger that same adrenaline response we talked about. The body senses a drop in blood volume as a threat, so it pumps out catecholamines to keep the heart going. You end up with the same racing heart and night sweats that people mistake for anxiety, but it's actually a mineral balance issue.
And then there's the overlap with other conditions. We can't ignore that adrenal insufficiency rarely exists in a vacuum. There's a higher prevalence of sleep apnea in certain types of endocrine disorders, and chronic pain from joint issues or muscle weakness can keep the nervous system in a state of high alert.
Correct. And for those with secondary or tertiary adrenal insufficiency, there might be other pituitary hormones involved, growth hormone or thyroid-stimulating hormone, which all have their own specific rhythms. If any one of those is slightly off, the entire circadian orchestra is out of tune. This is why standard treatment doesn't work for everyone. One person might do best with a larger morning dose, while another might need a tiny sliver of hydrocortisone right at bedtime to prevent that 3 a.m. adrenaline spike. It's highly individual.
It sounds like the goal isn't just to replace the hormone, but to try and replicate the movement of the hormone. We're moving toward a more nuanced understanding of chronopharmacology, basically the science of timing medication to match biological rhythms. Some newer modified release formulations are trying to solve the morning problem by being taken at bedtime and releasing the cortisol at 4 a.m., but they aren't available to everyone yet.
Those developments are promising because they acknowledge that the dawn phenomenon is critical. Until those are widely accessible, patients and doctors have to be detectives. They have to look at the specific timing of the fatigue, the nature of the dreams, and the physical symptoms upon waking to decide if the dose is too high, too low, or just poorly timed. Understanding that sleep is a metabolic process, one that requires energy to maintain, is a huge shift in perspective for most people.
It's a shift that moves us away from blaming ourselves for not being able to sleep and toward seeing it as a physiological puzzle to be solved. If you're waking up feeling like you've been hit by a truck, it's not a moral failing or just being a bad sleeper. It's your body signaling that its fuel and regulatory systems are struggling to keep up with the demands of the night.
Exactly. Sleep is when the body does its most important work. It's when the brain clears out metabolic waste and when the immune system recalibrates. If you have adrenal insufficiency, your body is already working harder than the average person's just to maintain homeostasis. When you rob it of that recovery time, everything else, the brain fog, the muscle weakness, the emotional resilience, takes a massive hit. It's the foundation of everything else we do to manage this condition.
For anyone who wants to dive deeper into these patterns or see how others are adjusting their schedules to find that balance, there are some great community discussions happening. You can find the full article this conversation was based on in the My Adrenal Life Facebook group. It's a space where people share their experiences with everything from medication timing to dealing with that afternoon crash. And it's a great place to connect with others who truly understand the wired but exhausted struggle.
It's vital to remember that while the physiology is complex, the goal is simple: helping your body feel safe enough to rest. Whether that means adjusting the timing of a dose or ensuring your blood sugar is stable overnight, small changes can lead to a significant improvement in quality of life. You aren't just fighting your own brain, you're learning to work with a system that has lost its internal compass.
And that's a journey that takes patience. Restoring a rhythm doesn't happen overnight, especially when you're manually managing what used to be automatic. But understanding the why behind the symptoms is the first step toward taking control back from the clock.
Science gives us the map, but the community helps us navigate the terrain. It's about finding the specific rhythm that works for your unique body and recognizing that sleep is not a luxury. It's a biological requirement that deserves as much attention as the daytime doses.
If this helped you understand your own sleep patterns a bit better, please consider sharing this with someone else in the adrenal community who might be struggling through their own 3 a.m. wake-up call.